Hello, I'm CJ Wellerman. Don't forget to subscribe to our show. Now let's get into it. Is the United States and Israel preparing for another war in the Middle East? And has the United States secretly partnered with the Taliban to invade Iran? These are serious questions, so let's look at the facts and recent events to see if we can piece together what's going on here. We start with the Persian Gulf, where the United States deployed 3,000 troops last month to the Red Sea aboard 2 warships as tensions escalate in the Straits of Hormuz.
We have seen a real increase now in their attempted attacks, or in some cases, sadly, successful attacks on maritime shipping in and around the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's outside the Gulf or just inside the Gulf. And this is activity that we've seen spike from the Iranians before, certainly spiking now. And we're sending a strong message, not just to Iran, but to our allies and partners, that we take this seriously, because so much, particularly oil, so much of that flows through the Strait of Hormuz. That's a choke point for the Middle East that has global trade implications. We got to make sure that we can defend our interests and the interests of our allies and partners. That's what these deployments, that's what they're all about.
When it comes to Middle East, it's always about oil for the United States. And it drives Washington, D.C. mad that an independent Iran still controls much of the world's oil supply.
Disputes.
So what's going on behind the scenes with this is that, as we know, Iran oil is sanctioned, and so they are not permitted to be selling their oil on the global market. And so the United States is actually patrolling the waters for oil that's being illegally sold.
Lurking as always in the background is the state of Israel, which has been preparing for an all-out war against Iran since February, the month it conducted air drills to simulate an air assault on Iran's nuclear facilities and a ground assault against Iranian border positions. Which explains why you're now seeing the Israel lobby plant stories in friendly US media outlets to garner American public support. But now let's momentarily shift our attention to Afghanistan, where the Taliban not only threatened to invade and conquer Iran 2 months ago, after tensions boiled over from a long-time dispute over access to the Helmand River's water supply, but also Taliban soldiers attacked Iranian border positions with US weapons on May 27th.
The combat took place outside the Iranian village of Makakai. Satellite imagery, along with ground combat footage published on Twitter, appears to reveal a Taliban attack position situated near a rocky berm just a few hundred meters from the Iranian border outpost. Video footage shows the Taliban fighters engaging with small arms weaponry, including US-manufactured M240 machine guns and M16 rifles, of which thousands were left behind in the withdrawal.
We will circle back to these US weapons in a moment. But barely 8 weeks after the Taliban and Iranian troops exchanged fire, US government officials met with their Taliban counterparts for the first time since the Taliban ousted the US-backed puppet regime 2 years ago. Coincidence? But before we go on, we urgently need your help to counter injustices in the Muslim world, and we can't continue this effort without you. So please consider supporting my journalism at patreon.com/CJ Wellerman. Our program is made possible only because of the support we receive from our wonderful patrons. Please join them in helping me bring these stories to a wider audience. Thank you. Now back to our show. The release put out by the US State Department shows the US government has found common ground with the Taliban, after it gave assurances it won't host terrorist groups on Afghan soil that threaten US interests. This is hugely significant because it represents a stunning reversal of US policy and a melding of the ice between 2 forces that waged a bloody and merciless 2 decades-long war against each other, one that resulted in a humiliating defeat for the United States. But this changing of attitudes towards an old foe shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who knows well the history of US geopolitics. Friends soon become enemies, and enemies just as quickly become friends. I mean, let's not forget that barely 1 decade before the US declared war on the Taliban in 2001, it was arming and funding the Afghan Mujahideen, the very same men who would later establish the Taliban, and the same men President Reagan invited into the White House in 1986. But back then, we didn't know these guys by scary-sounding Islamic names, but as freedom fighters, because they were waging a war against our then sworn enemy, the Soviet Union. Today, the sworn enemy of the US is Iran, and therefore it goes without saying that were Iranian forces to invade and occupy Afghanistan tomorrow, then the US would start arming the Taliban and calling them freedom fighters too. But here's the thing, Iran has shown no interest in invading Afghanistan, but the Taliban has plenty of US weapons. In fact, the US left behind a staggering $7 billion worth of military hardware in the newly established Islamic Emirate.
Data on the US Defense Department shows that from 2003 to 2016, the US provided the Afghan National Army with nearly 76,000 vehicles, 208 aircraft, and 600,000 weapons. Out of those weapons, we're talking about more than 350,000 rifles, nearly 65,000 machine guns, and almost 10,000 RPGs.
Several months ago, the Taliban even paraded through the streets of Kabul dozens of US armoured troop carriers it had restored to full operational use. So a quick summary of where things are situated now would read like this: that at the same time tensions are escalating between the US and Iran, and between Iran and the Taliban, the US sends American diplomats to Doha to warm and form a new relationship with the Taliban government. Am I the only one who finds this highly suspicious? Look, yes, the Biden administration is trying desperately to revive the Iran nuclear deal that President Trump tore up in 2017. But according to credible State Department sources, the negotiations are going nowhere because the Iranian government no longer trusts the US to keep its word. I mean, even Biden told a group of Iranian American voters early this year that the deal is, quote, dead.
President Biden, could you please announce that JCPOA is dead? Can you just announce that? No. No, why not? No. A lot of reasons. It is dead. But I can announce it.
This is why Biden is now deploying more and more American soldiers and military assets to the Middle East. Because he, along with every US president that came before him, has promised Israel that it will not allow Iran to possess a nuclear weapon under any circumstances. Yes, another clear example of how Israel steers and dominates the direction of US foreign policy in the region. And if you want a detailed understanding of how the Israel lobby bends the US government to its will, then read this book. But the key point here is this: Israel has been desperately pushing the US to start a war against Iran for years to avoid getting its hands dirty, which is why Netanyahu stood before the US Congress in 2015 to sell a war against Iran.
Iran's regime is as radical as ever. Its cries of death to America, that same America that it calls the Great Satan, as loud as ever. Now, this shouldn't be surprising, because the ideology of Iran's revolutionary regime is deeply rooted in militant Islam. And that's why this regime will always be an enemy.
To Israel's great frustration, however, no US president wants to send hundreds of thousands of US soldiers to fight a war against Iran on Iranian soil, mostly because every US president understands how deeply unpopular another conflict in the Middle East would be among American voters. This is where the Taliban comes into play as a potential proxy force for the United States, a country that has a long and checkered history of outsourcing its conflicts to proxy forces, because they provide the US the cover of plausible deniability and result in the deaths of foreign peoples, not Americans. In fact, the use of proxy forces has been official US doctrine since the failure of conventional US forces in Vietnam. It's how President Reagan killed more than 1 million people in Central America during the 1980s. So the question being asked by US officials about Iran today is this: why not the Taliban? It's already armed to the teeth with American weapons and hates the Iranian government as much as the US. And while the Taliban might not have the power and capability to match Iranian forces in peer-to-peer combat, they have the experience and wherewithal to create plenty of havoc and to keep Iran busy on its eastern border, while the US carries out operations in the Persian Gulf, which would effectively force Iran to fight a war on two fronts. Also, the US has plenty of leverage over the Taliban. The Islamic Emirate not only wants an end to diplomatic isolation, but the US holds $3.5 billion it stole from Afghanistan, funds that the Taliban is desperate to get its hands on to power up the country's dire economy. Now, all of this adds up to a nightmare situation for young Afghan and Iranian men and women, who now face the increasing likelihood of being slaughtered in the middle of nowhere, and for the advancement of US and Israeli interests in the Middle East, adding to the 4.5 million Muslims who have already been killed by US-led wars since 2001. We should also be concerned about the welfare of 5 million Afghan refugees who have taken shelter in Iran during the past 2 decades, particularly because the latest hostilities have caused anti-Afghan sentiment to rise in the Persian country. International media should be raising awareness about these developments because the lives of millions of people hang in the balance. But none of my colleagues in the media are willing to piece these pieces of the puzzle together, which at the end of the day is why we launched this program. To report injustices in the Muslim world, the mainstream media is unwilling or incapable of reporting. So while the media turns a blind eye to US and Israel meddling in Muslim lands, this program will certainly keep its eye on US activities in the Persian Gulf and along the Iran-Afghan border. And we'll report back when we have new information. Anyway, that's my time for today. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and we kindly ask you please support our effort to expose and confront injustices in the Muslim world by becoming a member of this show at patreon.com/CJWorleman. We can't produce, sustain and grow this show without your help, and we offer exclusive benefits to those who do. But for now, good night, good morning, wherever you are, and stay blessed.